Welcome, everyone. This is the panel on innovative mobile research at Facebook. So we will go ahead and get started. A couple quick reminders for everyone. If you believe you might be in the wrong room or you're looking for a different session, this is your chance to get up and find the session you're looking for. Also, you're welcome to take photos during the presentation, but please be mindful of those around you. And please be aware that the sessions here in the ballroom are being recorded, so the presenters and attendees will be recorded. So if you're not okay with that, also I suggest going to another session. And don't forget to share your experience on social media. You can use the hashtag UXPA2016. So with that, I will welcome our panel.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jen. You've heard from me a lot. You know that I'm Jen from UXPA and from Facebook. I'm really proud to be a part of this panel and to introduce some of my amazing colleagues. We have Vivian, UX researcher for Instagram, David, UX researcher for Messenger, Nick, UX researcher for Facebook, Lori is a UX researcher for Instagram, and Dave is a UX researcher slash lab extraordinaire for all of us. So we'll be talking to you today about some of our innovative methods that we've been using to do mobile research, and we'll be sure to have some time at the end for questions. There's a microphone right there in the center, so you can be prepared for some questions and head over to that microphone when we get there. All right, so I figured we'd start off talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we face in mobile research. Oftentimes, people want to conduct mobile research, but there are some considerations and some challenges that come with that. So could you share with us some of the challenges associated with conducting mobile research?
Okay, I guess I'll start off. So I think this is fairly obvious. The challenge of mobile research is that people can use mobile devices literally everywhere. And I think that has definitely caused a lot of challenges because most of our traditional research methods have sort of been set up for the desktop area, where it's literally a person at a table of some sort typing on a keyboard with a display. And mobile completely throws that paradigm out the window. So given that it is mobile and can be used anywhere, the environment presents all these challenges that we never really had to think about when we were trying to do research on people's mobile experiences. Challenges like other people, noise, light, the amount of time pressure someone's on, the amount of concentration that they have to actually pay attention to the mobile experience. All these things are very different when we try to understand how people use mobile devices. And that challenges a lot of our thinking about what is good design, because I could be using something on my phone here at the West End in Seattle, and it could work great. It's intuitive, it's easy for me to understand, but I could use that same interface, that same user experience running through SeaTac Airport trying to catch my flight with a roller bag, or say Saturday afternoon at a Costco in suburban Seattle, which is like the most stressful place in the entire world. And that interface may completely break down because it's simply because we did not take those factors into place when we were designing and researching it. So I think just that in itself is a huge challenge.
I'm going to add to that a little bit. One of the other things that's challenges when we think about doing research, lots of times things are still in the prototype or the testing phase, so we're using particular mobile devices for that, and that might not actually be the devices that your main users are using, right? So, you're testing it on the newest iPhone, the newest Android phone, and it's working great, but then when you actually, in practice, are rolling it out, people don't have those devices or don't have the latest upgrades on them. So there's that kind of challenge with, do you want to have the research be on their own device, which might not be as translatable across devices, but at least will be a more realistic experience.
Yeah, I would add to that along the device line, especially if you're thinking about doing research, if any of your users are in other countries. A lot of the devices that I know our designers and design teams like to test with are iPhones, but much of the world uses Android, and they're not even like the top of the line Androids, right? So making sure that we're testing also on older devices is something that we've done a lot at Facebook, as well as thinking about like the type of connectivity that people use. So it's not just about like mobile, but it's how people are using it, like the connection speeds and how much memory or space they have on their phone, or how much data they're using. There's a lot of considerations depending on the populations you're working with.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What would you say are some considerations that researchers should take into account when they are conducting mobile research in other countries?
Yeah, so piggybacking on what Lori was saying about connectivity. So there's like, to me, there's three things that kind of come up that are big to consider when you're doing international mobile research. The first is connectivity. The second is devices. And the third is just like where you are as far as the environment you're in. And this kind of goes back to what David was saying as well about out and about, or in somebody's home. So to the connectivity one, you're gonna have issues, and you need to think about if you're wanting to intercept somebody on the street and do a street intercept and want them to show you how they use their mobile device, connectivity might be terrible in that spot. So one of the things that we like to do is think about if we're doing street intercepts, can we do it somewhere where there's either good connectivity, or maybe it's the city's Wi-Fi hotspot, so that we know that they'll have some access to data to be able to show us what they're doing. When it comes to devices, I think this is also what Lori mentioned, is that not only is there a challenge with they might be using older devices, but also some of the equipment we use to record is meant for a certain device size, right? So when we have these documentation cameras, they can be set up for a smaller phone, and they might have a huge brick of a phone that which the screen doesn't actually fit on that. So making sure that you have other kinds of recording equipment with you that can be adjusted to kind of pan back and be able to see the whole experience. And the last is kind of where you are. One of the things that we forget about is that if you're doing research in someone's home, you don't realize that there might not be a whole lot of power outlets the way that we have. So, and also you're going to need the prongs for that country. So sounds kind of basic, but it's things that you do have to kind of consider when you're going to other markets.
And I'd also say that in addition to that stuff, also the other market, the culture and the norms do play into the effect of how people use mobile devices. Now this may seem strange to us, but in a lot of what we call emerging markets, people share devices. So if you're trying to research somebody using a mobile phone, it might be a shared mobile phone with lots of other people's stuff on it. Which is something that's kind of foreign to us. So a lot of the experiences and things that we have set up sort of assume that the mobile device is a personal device to yourself and to no one else, whereas in a lot of other countries, it is shared among a family. And then I think the other thing that sort of comes into play is that I think a lot of us are hammering on the devices to make a strong point that devices do vary widely. For example, in India and other countries, they have something called a dual SIM phone, which is a phone with 2 SIM cards in it. One's a data SIM, one's a phone SIM, because that's the way the phones are set up, and it makes sharing that device a lot easier if you have 2 different SIM cards in it, right? This can wreak havoc depending on what you're trying to actually understand of that person's mobile experience. So these things definitely need to be taken into account, along with all the other things that Lori and Vivian have mentioned already.
Dave, I know you're involved in creating the mobile sleds that we use when we're conducting mobile research. Are there any special considerations when researchers are planning for international versus in the States?
Internationally, well, Vivian mentioned some of the models of sleds we had focused on smaller devices, like they might have been created when the iPhone 5 was popular and that sort of screen size, but then all these bricks come out like the 6 Plus, or larger Android devices are more popular. So just I've modified the design to accommodate the larger devices. There's also other tools you could bring with you that are more adjustable. It can adjust to different devices as opposed to having a sled on a stand that's a fixed size. You can just get a different camera that can allow it to be adjusted more.
And the sled that we're talking about, in case you haven't seen that, it's kind of like what would you call that? Like a sideways U-shaped plastic where the phone sits on the bottom, and then there's a camera affixed to the top, and then you can plug that into a computer and be able to observe what's on the person's screen, so you're not all hovering around the person as they're interacting.
You can find some of these designs online too. I think Mr. Tappy is a popular device for this. That one's actually adjustable.
Well, and I had an experience in Indonesia where I assumed the research partner would have those devices, and the day before conducting research, I discovered she didn't have a mobile sled. So, thought quick about how to handle that and went out and bought some selfie sticks and some webcams and some tape, and taped them to the top of the stick and used the part that usually the camera's in out here on the selfie stick. That ended up being the sled, and that was adjustable because it was a selfie stick, so by design, it worked really well. So yeah, there's definitely lots of different.
I think the lesson is like be flexible, have some extra tools in your toolkit. So if you arrive at a region thinking, oh, things are going to go this way, they're probably not. So just be flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, that was definitely a big lesson for me, in terms of preparedness. Like, don't assume that they're going to have those things. Bring your own sled and lots of adapters, and make sure that you're like a self-contained unit. Okay, so what else? So now that actually we're talking a little bit about equipment here. We've been talking about international work and how to prepare for that. But in general, what do you do to ensure that you're prepared when conducting mobile research? Are there special considerations outside of desktop that we haven't already covered?
Okay, but before I want to add about the international thing too, just because while we all would love to go out and do international research, sometimes you also may not have that capability, either due to resources or just, mostly due to resources. Or time is a resource, for example. We do have ways that you can also emulate sort of what it's like to use mobile devices in other countries. Facebook actually has a way for all of you guys to throttle you, to slow down your connection speed. What?
I didn't know about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
I didn't know.
So
I don't have to go to 2G network areas.
yes. So they have ways for you to emulate 2G, 3G connections. Sometimes they also have ways to emulate specific countries, what the connectivity is like. Even the Wi-Fi in different countries, it actually runs at very different speeds. Do you happen to remember the name of it?
I think it's air traffic control.
Yes, it's called air traffic control. So if you do a search for that, you guys can connect to that with your mobile devices and actually simulate that speed. If you want, it's a great thing for you to show the teams that you're working with too, how devices might actually work if you were in other countries. I know that Vivian and I have also gone out and bought devices that are more the year class of other countries, right? So those are actually, because they're older models of phones, quite inexpensive for you to pick up and kind of to have folks test out.
Amazon has them. You can buy them on Amazon. Shout out to our sponsor.
Oh, we're still talking about what you should prepare for?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. In terms of mobile research, a lot of times people immediately think it's okay, do I need to do iOS or Android, or do I need to do both? And one thing I've talked to my teams is there a substantial difference in terms of what you want to know and what you want to figure out? A lot of design actually is fairly similar across both platforms. So even though the team may think of them as different designs and different platforms, you don't necessarily need to test on both if the experience is substantially similar. So I'd keep that in mind, is that, okay, do you really need, what platform do you really need to evaluate on, right?
Can I argue that for a second? I'm going to give a counterpoint on that. You're absolutely right that lots of times the design isn't different. What I have found is often, particularly people who have been completely set in, they're always used an iPhone or they've always used an Android. Even though the design experience is the same, the user that is going through the experience is sometimes kind of like worked up about like, oh, where's the back button? Or like, I don't know how to unlock it, or all these kind of things that might not be directly relevant to the design, but might actually like be worth having two phones just in case someone is, you know, a little bit of a laggard on technology to go from device to device.
And how do you decide to have them use their phone versus supplying a phone?
Sure, I'd say that depends on the context. So there's pros and cons to each, I'd say. Sometimes if you're bringing somebody into the lab, you may not want to have them on their device if it's something that they may clear out information on ahead of time. I work on search, so that's a concern that we face. We want to get people in their natural circumstance, so sometimes that's a little bit discouraging in that case. Most of the time, however, I think it's good to get them on their own device if it's possible, because they are interacting on the platform that they're most familiar with, so the affordances and habitual use all comes along. But there are times when you're working on the prototype phase that's not going to be always possible. So you just have to deal with those trade-offs and where you are in the development cycle to do what's kind of optimal for the learnings you're trying to get at that time.
Mm-hmm. And how do you decide, when you're in a prototype stage, how do you decide whether or not you're going to display that on a phone or just display it on a desktop screen?
Yeah, sure, I'll take a stab at it as well. So generally, I always like to get it on the device just so we get a little bit more at the naturalistic case rather than on the screen where they're not holding it in their hand, and the constraint of the screen real estate may not be as one-to-one. But yeah.
Even if it's like a low fidelity prototype, if it's just an image, we'd like to put those on the phones themselves because people becomes more real and you see them starting to try to interact so you can understand how people would actually use it if it wasn't tappable.
Yeah, I am in agreement with both Lori and Nick in terms of trying to get it on a phone screen size by having it displayed, even if it's on a monitor at approximately the same size of a phone. It's just a different view they have of it. They're going to notice details that they may not notice before. The lighting, again, could come into play. It's just a different environment in which they're consuming it. So that makes it very difficult and potentially causes problems when you're trying to translate their understanding from that to an actual phone. The only place there, I think, one of the places I think where you could actually get away with putting it on a large screen, on a monitor on a screen, if you can't get it onto an actual test device or a phone itself, is if you're doing what I'd call sort of a concept understanding, where you're not really, the design is not the focus of the actual goal. It's to get an understanding of the concept that you're trying to convey. In that case, the design details, the size, the relative position, doesn't matter as much. But again, I would still warn that if you can, try to, at least in my opinion, you should try to get it on an actual phone.
I'd like to add an example I've seen where we've presented things on the desktop that were intended for the phone is during the design process, a researcher was trying to test out different layouts on the UI, so different prototypes, like sometimes the button's here, sometimes it's in a different place. He also wanted to do eye tracking on top of that, which is difficult on a mobile device. Right, Jen? Jen gave a talk on that recently. So he was able to present, he had still photos of all these UI layouts, and he presented them to the participants, and they were able to track that with their eyes across the different iterations.
On desktop.
On desktop.
Yeah, and eye tracking on mobile is getting better and better. There are eye tracking glasses, and Toby advocates for, they have the little bar eye tracker, which you can use on a stand, on a mobile stand. They also have the eye tracking glasses, so it certainly is possible. without having to go the desktop route. But it's difficult to get going often, as we have learned.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about stakeholders for a minute. So how do you get stakeholders involved when you're doing mobile research, whether it's in home, in store, on the streets, internationally in people's homes? Like, how do you keep stakeholders engaged in the research?
So this also goes back to the international considerations we were discussing before. So something I found is really simple for in-homes and in-store visits is just to project their phone onto a laptop that's a little bit distant from the interviewee and from you as the interviewer, just so everybody's not crowding around the two of you, trying to look onto their screen to keep context with where you're at in the interview. So just simply projecting that a few feet away keeps your stakeholders involved, lets them know exactly where you are, where they are in the product, so they can be engaged with everything that's going on and then later have follow-up questions that are directly attuned to what was going on with the participants' interaction. Yeah, and this is really simple to do on iOS, and then this is another case where we'd use the sled on laptop, or on Android, yeah.
Yeah, adding to that, there's also kind of the consideration of stakeholders as they come along. So I love it when engineers and designers and PMs are really excited about what's happening, and they're like all leading in and watching on the laptop. One of the things to keep in mind is, particularly when somebody's kind of like new to coming along with research, is they'll want to like help the person, right? So if somebody's really struggling to get past a step, the designer or the engineer will be like, can you just show her like how to do that? And it's like, well, no, because the whole point is for us to see how long it takes and how it works in a natural environment. So I think there's a good reminder when you're coming on board to say, listen, you might see things that you realize are like painfully not working. Let's just wait. Let's see where it goes. If the person's like, okay, I'm stuck, I'm done, then we can step in. So it's just a good reminder to tell your team, because it's great that they're so excited and want to help the person, but then you kind of lose the insights from it. So the other thing I wanted to add is also, particularly when you're traveling, everybody has their time constraints, and often you can't bring along the whole team. So what, Lori mentioned about kind of these empathy devices, devices that they can kind of look at and see what the experience was like. Another thing that I did recently was I brought a 360 camera with me in the research. So not only do we have the recording of what it looked like on the mobile device, they can actually like see through the 360 recording what it feels like to be in the home and the environment where somebody is using the device. So they can kind of feel like they came along when maybe their job doesn't allow them that time or luxury of traveling for it.
Is that something you stream, or you record that and then you share that after?
Sorry. So that's definitely an after kind of thing. 360 is a massive file sizes. So, you're not able to get the whole experience. It's more for that snippet of here's a little feel of that, and then they can stream, or they can watch along with the actual sled and the laptop. Yeah.
So I definitely agree that projecting the person's mobile screen is really great in terms of observation in the field. However, that does bring challenges. For example, if you're using a sled, that sled needs to be connected to a laptop. Now, depending on where you are going and what you're having this person doing, it can be very awkward for them to be walking around with a camera sled connected to a laptop with a bunch of people trying to watch it at the same time. What we've experimented with at Facebook is that there are now these sort of products that allow you to project your phone screen onto a laptop wirelessly. Things like Reflector, things like Air Server. And that gives the person a little bit more freedom in terms of not being tethered to a sled or a laptop, and gives them complete mobility in terms of the phone itself. For example, if you want to watch somebody taking photos with their phone, you can't, adding a sled to a phone is going to inhibit the way that they would naturally do that. So therefore, if you have something that you can do wirelessly so they can move the phone wherever they want, they can go, they can crouch, they can stand up tall and take their pictures, I think is very, very good. I will say the problem with that is that you lose their fingers if you don't, because you don't have, obviously these things only project the screen, they don't project their actual positions of their hands or where their fingers are. So that is also something a bit of a drawback. But I think, you know, if that's your situation where you want somebody to have complete freedom and mobility in terms of how they hold and position their phone, I think those are good alternatives.
You just reminded me of eye tracking, another trade-off when we're using eye tracking glasses. It's recording wherever the person's looking. So if the person is using your mobile device and then they look up, that is what you are seeing from the back room, right? Where they're looking in the natural environment. And I attempted to do that with a team who, you know, the engineers were very interested in what was going on the screen, like how long the little spinner was on the screen. So, you know, we couldn't use eye tracking glasses. It sounds like with a lot of these technologies, there's a trade-off, and you have to figure out what data is the most important and then figure out how you're going to stream it, how you're going to record it, how you're going to share it, and so on.
I've seen some research presentations, and I very briefly experimented with body cams, where, you know, instead of having, you know, these sleds or trying to reflect this, just put a camera on the person and try to have them hold their phone sort of in the view of the body cam. I can tell you it does not work very well. So that's one thing I would not recommend if you're trying to do mobile research in, sort of in the wild.
Did you also experiment with, I forget what you call it, like hugging if it's like remote research, you have the person put their phone.
So the hug a laptop method, which if you guys aren't familiar with, is that most standard laptops these days come with a webcam sort of built into the top of it. So the big drawback of mobile research, if you want to see someone using their mobile phone, it's kind of hard to do that remotely. So what you do is you flip your laptop around away from you, you stick your hands in front of, holding your phone in front of the webcam there, and you sort of use it like this, which, if you really need to, it does work. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it's something. Granted, it's not the most terribly comfortable thing to do for a prolonged amount of time, but, you know, in a pinch, it definitely does work. I don't know if anybody else has had any experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the question is, if it has to be done remotely and you're asking them like, okay, can you hug a laptop or whatever it is, the other question you have to ask yourselves is how important is it to get every moment? Some research doesn't require that you need to capture every moment. So there's a couple other alternatives, right? Like if it's in the wild, it might just be about how often they're taking their phone out. So you can record from further away and notice like how many times do they take a selfie? How many times do they check the phone? You don't have to directly see the screen. Another is, you know, when you're doing kind of like mobile diary studies and you just have people submit a screenshot or a short recording of their phone, if really what you're trying to get at is like just kind of the content and what's happening in the moment as opposed to all the specifics of usability.
I would also point out that we do tend to rely a lot on technology. We have fantastic labs at Facebook with, you know, we can capture all kinds of different angles, but it's also important as the researcher, like, don't depend too much on those tools. You should be mentally present and not depend on having to go back and look at videos, because we don't always have time to do that. So if you're just paying attention to how the person's using it and your observers, your stakeholders are there to watch that as well, then, you know, we don't need to go back and look at videos we've recorded, or that, you know, your findings are already sort of in their heads.
So going back to watch videos of facial expressions, for example, to assess when people are frustrated.
Exactly.
Something we were chatting about earlier. Oftentimes you can notice these things in real time, right? And you don't have to go back and look at
Yeah,
videos.
so there's tools, there's biometrics tools that can capture facial expressions, and you know, the software even that can track your face and how you're feeling. But, you know, as the researcher, you hopefully empathize with the person, and you can sort of detect, oh, this guy's getting really mad, he's about to throw this phone through the window.
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, it comes back to the type of data that you're collecting and how you're going to use it. If you have a large sample size and you need that quantitatively how many people got upset at this certain interaction, then probably going back and viewing videos, or having some software that helps with that is helpful. But if you're doing a small study and, you have a handful of participants, yeah, I agree that observing how they're interacting, in the moment is really helpful, useful. All right, let's talk a little bit about moving forward. What would you say has changed in terms of mobile research in recent years? And thinking a little bit further, where do you see mobile research heading? I don't know if I told you guys that one ahead of time.
All right, so I think the biggest issue that's going to affect mobile research, obviously the advances of devices, wearables, things like smartwatches, the evolution of phones, is that the question of ecological validity is going to really, really start to hit home in terms of mobile research. These things, like I mentioned the first thing I said, is like these things aren't used in a lab, nor are they used in a very controlled environment. How do you assess and evaluate and understand user experience if you cannot realistically replicate those situations? So I'll tell a little short story that I think illustrates this. So my fiance was rear-ended on a very busy highway in the Bay Area. It's one of the busiest, Highway 101, and she had to pull over to the side. So she has the AAA app on her phone, and the idea of it is that if you get into an accident, you open up the AAA app, and then you fill out the accident information, take your photos, and then you go on your merry way, so you don't have to call or anything like that. However, she was very emotional because it's a very scary thing to be rear-ended. She was on the side of a busy highway with cars zooming past her. There's all this noise, and it's a very emotional, heightened sensory experience, and that affects the way that she would try to use that app. And how do we know if that's a good design, or how do we know if that's going to really work if we can't create that situation again and see that design in that type of situation? I think that's a big consideration going forward as these apps can do more and more things, as these devices can do more and more things. Because quite honestly, I don't think we could ethically put a research participant in a situation like that. So we need to, I think one of the big things that I think about, and I think is definitely what I'd love to see more innovation in, is attempting to understand that and attempting to bring those factors into how we observe, understand, and evaluate design for mobile going forward.
Awesome. I'm going to handle the look back part since you did such an awesome job in the look forward. So I think one of the things that I've noticed changing over the last few years is not only just the technology, but the different audiences that we're doing research on. So and when we think about young people, current teens, for example, this is a generation that now has grown up from a very young age being very mobile savvy, and thinking about who's the audience that we're going to be testing with. There's this huge gap between an older generation and when they started using mobile devices versus a younger generation. So, being really mindful, I think we've had to become really mindful of who is our audience and who do we care is going to really be able to use the product, because you can't just say, oh, we'll get a general sample of people, because there's this pocket of our users that are emerging who things are a lot more intuitive for them. So it's like, is that who we want to get the feedback from? Do we need to also care about how it's working for those who, smartphones aren't, a second or a third arm, like an appendage of theirs, right?
Mm-hmm. So what do you suggest? So we have, people who have all different experiences and all different ages, and we have all sorts of devices, different sizes, and different internet speeds. So what do you do?
Sorry, I think that's where you have to kind of narrow the focus of your research. I mean, it's the same with any kind of research, academic as well. Sometimes you have to say, okay, I have to go for a smaller sample or a more targeted sample and just decide this is what we care most about. Or because we're so fortunate, there's a bunch of us, split your resources, say, hey, you're the teens expert, can you do my research with teens while I'm doing it with emerging markets or something, and then we'll come regroup and see how it's all working.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a solution to the problem I just raised, which is typical for a researcher. But what I would say is that there's a couple things that I think don't solve the problem, but can help us push us in the right direction. Is that I think understanding the environment and the setting of where these devices are going to be used in the key areas is helped, even if you can't observe it actually in that environment. At least you have awareness of what factors and sort of what potential externalities are going to come in to help you better evaluate whether this is a good design or understand the experience better. There have been I think something from human factors that I think our community could adapt is simulators. So, we already talked about air traffic control in terms of simulating lower networks, less high-speed networks. But what other types of simulators could we hopefully, sort of innovate on and build so that we can better understand a lot of these things that we can't control, but sort of simulate them in an environment. So I think that's also a very potentially interesting idea that's sort of been around in human factors for a very long time.
And I think one thing that may come more into the foreground to get at ecological validity is more remote, unmoderated testing, which is kind of more an experience, a sampling approach that catches people more in these natural moments. And I think there are a couple tools, like usertesting.com I know has one that they've been working on, and I expect more of that to come to the foreground and be more efficient and useful later as well.
And user Zoom.
And Look Back.
Of course.
Look Back has a good mobile product as well.
I think I'd like to open up the floor for questions. If we have questions. Mike's right in the middle.
Hello.
Hello.
So do you have to deal with anything like participant agreements or NDA type forms when you're doing intercepts out in the field? Have you dealt with that?
That depends on the context of the research. If we're presenting something that is a little bit proprietary or experimental, then absolutely we always ensure that we get NDAs for that. But if we're dealing with current experiences, then it's not always necessary.
Sometimes it's not as much about an NDA, to Nick's point about because it's just their natural experience, but often because we are recording and making videos and going to be sharing back, sometimes depending on where we are, we have to get a release for just like an image release that we're going to be using their
Right.
reactions.
Do you have trouble, like if you're just out in the mall or whatever, intercepting people?
Malls are a very challenging place.
Because they're owned by someone?
Yeah, so particularly outside of the U.S., like just forget about malls. In most cases, they just won't let you in because of, especially if you have any kind of recording device. And even a sled, they get nervous about that because they're like, oh, you're recording something. Sometimes even public parks can be a problem. Streets are the best, but because they are not owned by anybody, and you can record what you want on the street. So,
Thanks.
And I think even in addition to NDAs, we need to consider what are you asking this person to show on their phone. Now, I did talk about certain cultures where the phone is shared, so they might not necessarily want to show you things on their phone or do things on their phone because it's not theirs. Also, even in countries like the US, people carry a lot of personal stuff on their phone, personal photos, even the types of messagings or things they share on social media. They may not want to actually show you. So I think it's, if you're going to do intercepts or something like that, you need to be very upfront, in addition if you need an NDA or consent, what are you actually asking them to do and what are you asking them to potentially show? So therefore, a person doesn't freak out when you ask them to do something that they may not be totally comfortable with.
So I have a super fun anecdote about this, which is when we had a participant and we asked her, like, hey, can you show the most recent photos that you've used Instagram filters for? And she just froze. And we were like, oh, well, if you don't want to show us, you can just talk us through it. And she's like, I only use Instagram filters for naked selfies I sent my boyfriend. So not something that we would have anticipated, but again, now we know to be like, okay, start off with, hey, are you comfortable with showing us some of your photos? Maybe it doesn't have to be the most recent one, stuff like that, and keeping them feeling like what they're sharing is something they're comfortable sharing. So.
Isn't that what Snapchat is for?
Sounds like a special use case for marketing.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually. So, in the light of the fact that there is a lot of personal information stored on these devices, and people may or may not be cognizant of that going into some of these studies, how do you convince them to participate, knowing that some of their information may be inadvertently captured and then shared back to your team?
I can explain what we do in our experience now. If it's a sort of a usability or type of qualitative interviewing type of study, in our screener we will literally spell that out in terms of one of the questions is that this study may require you to show these certain types of things, right? So it's made very clear that's going to happen. What we also make clear in that description is that everything is confidential and will not be shared externally or anything like that. So it's simply for research purposes. We are not actually going to use the material for anything else. And at least in my experience, if you do ask that question, you should include a not sure option to that question. So yes, no, and I'm not sure. And then if they select not sure, that gives you the opportunity as a researcher or whoever's doing your participant recruitment to contact that person and say, we noticed you said you were not sure about this. Let me concretely explain what that means. And they sort of talk it through. And then for a person who may be on the fence, that might help allay their fears and be more willing to participate.
Yeah, and it's a fine line because you don't want to give away what you're doing, right? You don't want them to go in and because people think they're being tested and they want to ace the test. So you don't want to tell them too much where then they go into the app or the product and start using it, so they'll be an expert when they come in for the test. So for when I'm recruiting and in our screener, we just specifically ask if they will be okay using their device, but we don't tell them specifics. And then if they say no or not sure, then to screen them out. The other thing is over-recruit. I mean, we often over-recruit for no-shows, but you may have people who, once they sit down and in the lab or wherever it is you're talking to them, then they decide in that moment that they don't want to share, and then you have backups.
And the other backup you always have is, that's why it's always good to have a test device there and say, hey, I do want you to, for example, log into your account, but we don't need to see all the other stuff you have on your phone here. Can you can use this test device? So that's another way that you can kind of have a backup for those who aren't comfortable in that way. Yeah.
Can you speak on the research that went into the redesign for Instagram and what that experience was like, and maybe some of the reactions that you've gotten?
What specifically are you curious about?
Just the interface design and the logo, if you guys have any.
I mean, there's a lot of thought that went into both, I guess we can say that, right? And definitely there was a lot of testing, particularly on the interface that happened before it launched. So there was already a good percentage, not only of our kind of testing, but also in behavioral testing to just see, like, is this causing any issues where people can't find things that they usually used? Are we seeing a drop in certain areas being used because visually they're not finding what they're looking for? So there was a lot of that going into it to just make sure that, like, I would say kind of like a sanity check is to go in place. So, do you want to add anything, Lori? Nope. Nope.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to get your take on, I usually refer to it as the squirm cam of the picture-in-picture of the user's face, which in mobile is even more complex. It adds another layer of, you got to make technology work to it. And in some cases, it actually can't be done. If you're using like AirPlay or something, you may not be able to use it at all without walking around with a camera or something. I'm wondering how you feel about the value of it in the mobile testing that you do, and what use you make of it. You know, I mean, and I have an axe to grind, which is that I actually think it's as much of a distraction, even though people like it and it's sexy, and it makes it feel like more fun for the people who are observing, that it's actually a distraction. That you can tell from the person's voice, if you've got good audio, you can tell what state of mind they're in. So I'm wondering what your take on it is, whether you go to the trouble of capturing it and what the effect is.
So I think that the best is when someone can't see their own face, right? So anything you can do, so that's the problem with, like, if it's on, you know, a picture-in-picture where they can see themselves, it does tend to make them self-conscious. We have some ways where we've actually hooked up 2 separate documentation cameras, like IPVOs, where one is focused on the device and the other is focused on their face. Right. So to them, you know, it's such a little camera, they kind of forget that it's there, but when it's being recorded for people who are watching, it does show both the face and the device kind of side by side.
And just to clarify, when I say distraction, I mean a distraction for the observers, not for the participant.
I have to agree with you. It is my personal opinion that the picture cam of the person's face really adds next to nothing in terms of the actual evaluation. And it depends on, it also...
Oh, good, an argument.
Not
everybody agrees with
I
you.
will caveat that, but it depends on what you are actually having them do. Some things are cognitively demanding, right? So if somebody has a furrowed brow, or you know, looks like they're not having fun, it could be that they're just trying to concentrate on what they're doing on a mobile device.
Right.
Especially if you're like me, you have fat fingers. You know, it may not be that I'm frustrated at this experience of this app, it just means is like I hate typing on a mobile phone, right? It's very hard to interpret the correct signals, I would argue, from the facial thing. If somebody is upset, it could be they're thinking about something else. Like, I don't know. So I've never been a huge fan of that, and I personally do not employ it in any of the research that I do.
Okay.
So we do at Instagram.
You think it's vital?
Well, I actually, so I think it's especially useful when we're bringing video clips back to our teams. It builds a lot of empathy, and for like the different types of users of Instagram, you know, we have people we have like teens who are like 13 years old, and you look at them using the phone, and you're like, how are you so little? And then you have older folks too, and getting empathy around like all these people in addition to like their actual experience using the phone is really important. Otherwise, they're just like this disembodied voice using it. So go ahead.
Yeah, for empathy purposes, for pure research data purposes, I would argue that no, I don't see a huge amount of value in it. And again, this is my personal opinion. So.
Yeah, I disagree too. At my Facebook, at my version. Picture, you know, seeing the person's face definitely helps. I agree with building empathy, but also, you know, for example, in some recent safety check research, the facial expressions about what people were going through when they use safety check, it was really powerful. You know, it was really a part of the experience.
To your original point about how a lot can be told from the tone of the voice as they're talking, totally valid. I think we also have to think about, particularly outside the US, some people are not as emotive in the way that they speak, because they might not actually say like, oh, or wow, you know, but you'll pick it up with these kind of micro expressions of an eyebrow raise or a surprise. And I think that's where, from a not just an empathy perspective, but an actual data perspective, it's helpful.
This is another area where I found it's a little bit more important in international research, because when you're using a translator or translation service post hoc, a lot of this stuff comes through really monotone relative to the actual energy that was in the room at the time, and you can kind of get a bit more of that through their facial expression or body gestures that is otherwise lost. Yeah.
There's a similar debate among the one-way glass, like, is that creepy to, you know, you're talking about the participant being distracted by seeing themselves. Like, if they're in front of a big mirror, they're going to see themselves. It can be distracting. But at the same time, you know, if the stakeholders on the other side see a real person using that product, it definitely adds empathy. And, you know, there's endless debates about that as well.
Yeah, I personally would not like the one-way mirror if I could avoid it. I will have to say this is my final thing about the whole entire facial thing. my big beef with it is that I'm perfectly okay with you with recording the person itself, but why do you need a continuous shot of their face all the time, right?
Right.
I quite personally don't think that adds much in terms of the amount of effort and the amount of setup it requires to do that.
That's why I think is the distraction is having it up there constantly. It's very easy to start watching the face instead of watching what's actually happening. But you did so well with that. I'm sorry, somebody else wants to ask a question, but you did so well with that. I would ask the same question about showing the hands versus showing the tracking, showing an image on the screen of the virtual, track of where the fingers went. How much you prefer one over the other.
I think hands are really important because sometimes people are tapping somewhere and nothing's happening on the screen, and you would lose that interaction or lack thereof.
Are you talking about when you're using like a third-party app that's capturing the screen? Is that what you mean?
You mentioned one where you can see the screen,
Yeah.
but you don't see the fingers.
Yeah, but
like,
there's
you just see
also
what's
these
going on the
systems
screen.
that allow you to track the tap targets and where
You can
people's
set
pressure.
that you can set that in Android. You can just tell it show the taps on the screen,
yeah?
and it'll show up. Yeah.
It's the entire interaction, though. Like, what if they're hovering before they actually click, right? I think it is important to get that interaction.
Yeah, and they may not be in fashion now, but long nails were once a thing, right? So, yeah, so without that, that does add a fair amount of context, I would argue.
They're still in fashion for some people. The really long ones.
So my question is actually kind of in the same vein. Have you experimented with any of like the Miracast applications and capturing haptic feedback, but also tapping into like the gyroscope of the phone to see if like they're tilting it to look at it, and potentially like deploying something like that from like a mobile device management software, so you can actually like deploy, pull, and control that experience? Like, is that anything you've experienced or played around with, so you can do more remote kind of tests without actually being there, and have that control of still being able to lock the software down if you needed to? I can
talk a little bit about that. So like Miracast is similar to AirPlay and AirServer or Reflector.
Yeah.
One of the issues we have with those systems is if you're in a smaller office with like a simpler Wi-Fi network, like it's easy to get the device to talk to the recording system. But once you're on a corporate, like we have a corporate network at Facebook, obviously, and they lock down a lot of protocols. I think Bonjour is required on the Apple for that to work, and I'm not sure which protocol on the Android, but we've tried Miracast, we've tried Chromecast and Apple TV, and a lot of that stuff gets locked down. Also, once you try to connect that stuff, like one of those HDMI devices to a recording system, the copy protection circuitry is going to shut that down. I know there's an app called Lookback. One of the deal breakers for Facebook with that is Lookback will go to a third-party server. So, but again, if you're in a smaller company, you might be a little more flexible with some of those things. But we haven't tested out, like you mentioned, adjusting or playing with the accelerometer and some of the other devices in the phone. We haven't tried that.
So like from a pure, like not even so much the cast aspect, being able to capture just the raw data of how they interact with the application, having it on there. And I guess the other question is based on that, like how do you negotiate the performance of that application also running in tandem, affecting like the actual processing power of the phone? Like do you guys ever take that into consideration when it comes to that?
So we've tested those systems just for the sake of like, is this going to work in the lab? It hasn't really gotten past that phase though, to the point where we need to consider, is this going to affect the performance during the actual study when the participant is here, because it just hasn't gotten past the testing phase. But I find generally like pointing a camera at something is the most reliable way to capture it. That way you're not worrying about Wi-Fi dropouts or like connectivity issues. And it's old school, but again, it gets the fat fingers and it gets some other things too, and it's reliable.
Yeah, and I would argue is like, how much data do you really, really, really need to collect? Do you really need to know the position of the phone, the accelerometer, the velocity of it, or if that is really what you're looking for, then I don't think a user research study is exactly the most optimal way of collecting that type of data. I would argue that there are other ways to do that, and that use the data collection method that's going to get you the most actionable data, and that could be just a camera pointed at the person's fingers on a phone.
Could you talk about, designing for mobile, and Facebook and Instagram and all of these have mobile web versions and obviously the app version of it, and the subtleties between designing for, okay, they're still using Facebook, but it's a mobile web version versus the app version, and use cases are different. There's things that people expect from an app different from the web, and how you guys kind of design for that, and even just research those different objectives.
I'll quickly talk about this because I was sort of personally involved with this a couple of years ago. So a lot of our web-based Facebook is specifically mostly geared to people in what we call emerging markets, people with underpowered phones that can't process or can't reasonably perform with the Facebook app, which was built for sort of high-end smartphones. So in terms of that, I think a lot of things I think a lot of factors need to be taken into account. Number one, as people have said, is the actual phone that the person's using. What is the screen side? Particularly, what is the browser? Particularly if you're going into an emerging market. Lots of browsers have very funny ways of rendering certain types of designs. For a UC browser or an Opera browser may render your design completely different. There are certain phone manufacturers who have taken over the browser, so even if you type in facebook.com or something like that, or your website address.com, they'll redirect you to some search engine or to some portal, which will require an extra click to get there. I would also argue that for lots of mobile web versions, designers love iconography, because it's a much more elegant way of presenting an action. If you're on a really slow connection, your lovely iconography are going to end up as broken image links and things like that. So all those things really need to be taken into account when you're talking about mobile web and the audience you're trying to serve with mobile web.
So, and then from an Instagram perspective, we kind of went the opposite route. We started as mobile first and have expanded into web. So it's kind of also taking the perspective of what do you keep that's the same that you already have on mobile, or do you need to expand it out to web? So I think some of it isn't as much as like what works and doesn't work, but it's also a decision that you as a brand have to make to say, are we comfortable with the fact that there's going to be a lot of white space on web, because that wouldn't be there on a mobile phone. And I think the design challenges often aren't just as dichotomous as mobile versus desktop, but it's also just the screen size of mobile phones today. So that creates a bigger challenge that we often overlook. It's easy to think about, desktop, big screen, mobile phone, very different, very different use case. But sometimes what's more overlooked is the fact that different screen sizes are going to mean that pieces of information might get left off the screen. So.
57 seconds left.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding safety. How do you do, I don't know if you have input on this. I come from South America, so how do you deal with using the mobile out on the field while doing research? Because there's a safety issue, like people wouldn't use the mobile in the street, for example, and the mobile use is different if you are in the street and if you are inside a mall or whatever. Do you have any input on this?
Well, we did some, I'm sure others on the panel have done South America research. When I was doing research in South America, one of the things was, because there was such a crowd of us, it was more important to make sure that my stakeholders who were with us, like our internal clients, were smart about their own devices and not having their bags like backpacks and things like that. The actual participants felt pretty comfortable because they're surrounded by a group of people, so it wasn't quite like them just taking out their iPhone like in the middle of a busy street in Sao Paulo. I guess, like I was saying, the concern was more the people who were observing, because they were observing so intently that there isn't a safety issue there. We did find that there is a challenge with when you're trying to have conversations about using location tagging and things like that, because people are like, we want to say, show me. They're like, I don't know if I want people to know right now that I'm not at home, right? To send that signal out. So it's real.
I'll very quickly add to that. I have a little bit of different twist on security is that we were doing some research in India, which is a very extremely diverse population culture. So some of it is very modern, but some of it is very steeped in very strong sort of gender roles and culture. So we were doing research with this young woman who is not allowed to leave the house unescorted unless she's with a male relative, which has to be her father or her brother. So obviously that presents a bit of an issue if you want to understand how someone is using their mobile phone if they're not allowed to be mobile without these certain people around. So I think obviously that needs to be taken into account, and you may have to compromise in terms of where you may be able to conduct that research simply because of safety or because of those sort of cultural things.
All right, well, we are out of time. Thank you all very much for joining us.